All right, as we continue with Chapter 8, going on to Topic 2, the quadratic formula, we start to wonder, well, with factoring and with the completing the square, the principle of square roots, isn't that going to be enough tools to solve our quadratic equations? And you recall that last few that we did when we were completing the square and we got those fractions, and that was sort of tedious. So the answer is yes, there are other tools. And this is the main one. That is the quadratic formula. Now, let's just look at this. And actually, I showed this in another slide here in one of my earlier presentations when I was using the additional exercises to show you where the quadratic formula came from. So if we take this formula right here, which is standard form of the quadratic equation, and we solve it for the letter x, and we do so by completing the square right here, we actually get a value for x at the end. And just to go over this a little bit, the first thing they're doing is bringing the c over to the other side. Then they're dividing everything by a. Here the a's cancel out. Then you're taking half of the b term and squaring that and putting it here on both sides. And you factor this into its binomial square. These are like terms. So you then get this equals plus or minus the square root of that. And notice that this is a perfect square, so this, when you take the radical of this, it becomes 2a. And then you just transpose this to the other side, it becomes this. In some classes, as I've mentioned, the instructor asks the students to memorize this and be able to reproduce it on a test. We're not asking you that here. Know it by heart. Well, anyway. So what is the quadratic formula? And this is what we would ask you to memorize, just that. So there it is in standard form. There it is solved. This is called the quadratic equation. This is called the quadratic formula. Now, as you do the quadratic equation and put it in standard form, you get a value for A, you get a value for B, and you get a value for C. And it must be in this form to get the proper values, because that's how it was used when they solved to get the quadratic formula. So one of the first things we have to do is put something like this in standard form. So we have to transpose this -3 to the other side, where it will become a +3, and then equate it to 0. So now we have it. We have our A, which is 5, our B, which is a +8. Again, if it's positive, we don't mention the sign. And our C, which is a 3. So now we could put that into the formula. And let's do it right over here. They're going to do it on the next page. Now notice our B is a +8. But in the formula, the negative sign is part of the formula. So when we put in a positive b here, it becomes a negative 8 because it's the opposite of a positive 8, which is a negative 8. Then we just put our plus and minus, the square root. Now it's going to be b squared. B squared is always going to be positive because you're squaring it. That will be 64, or you could put 8 squared there if you want, but you can start to compute. Now minus 4 is in the formula. Now our a we said was 5. Put it in parentheses. And our c was a 3. And then to complete our substitution, we're just going to go 2 times a. We said a is 5, so this becomes a 10. Now, next stage. Well, we get our negative 8 plus or minus. Now, this is going to be a negative 20 times 3 is going to be a negative 60. And this is going to be a 4 here. And that's all going to be over 10. And you might say, well, look at this is a perfect square, so this is going to become a 2. All right, so let's just erase that and put a 2 there. Now we have a negative 8 and a negative 2, which is a negative 10 over 10. That's going to be a negative 1. And then we have a negative 8 and a positive 2. That's going to give us a negative 6 over 10, which becomes a negative 3/5. Now, whenever you have something like this, where you don't get any radicals in your answers, this could actually have been factored. So let's try to factor it. 5x squared plus 8x plus 3 equals 0. Now, we know that this is going to be a 5x and an x. Now, if we put the 3 here, that doesn't work. But if we put the 3 there, that works out very well. And they're all going to be plus. So when we equal each of these to 0, this becomes a negative 3/5, and this becomes a negative 1. And those are our solutions. Now, you never know, but the thing is, whether you do it by the quadratic formula or whether you do it by completing the square, which I wouldn't have done it because too many fractions, or just factoring, or as I say, the quadratic formula, you get the answers. They all should work. Thing is, you want to try to use the one that gives you the least possibility of having an error somewhere. And there's the work all laid out. And they say it can also be factored. Okay. So, steps for solving quadratic equations. Well, we have this one where you complete the square. We have this one where you can factor possibly. Or you can use the quadratic equation. But the key is, in using the quadratic formula, I should say, you have to put it in standard form. So you can define your various letters, your A, your B, and your C. And here they're using function which is just another little modification. Now, this one, when you solve it, you don't get, numbers. You get irrational numbers. You're going to get irrational numbers because the square root of 84, even though it can be simplified into 4 times the square root of 21, and then this is a 2, you get these 2 answers. Now, I'm not going to work all these out for you. Again, the key is put it in standard form, identify your A, B, and C, and then put it into the quadratic formula carefully through substitution, and then simplify. And your check will be your results in your math lab. You want to do some practice to be sure you get the skill needed and how to put it in the math lab. They usually want it as separate answers, like so. Okay, looking at example 3. Now you might say, oh, that's going to be, just solve it as an equation. No, because when you remove the parentheses, you get a quadratic. So how do we solve quadratic equations? Well, the key to all of them is to put them in standard form, which is what they're doing right here. Now, will that factor? No. Now, could you have used completing the square there? Possibly. But again, you're going to get a fraction when you take half of 1. So the easiest one then is the quadratic formula, where you identify A as 1, B as 1, and C as 2. You do the substitution. Now notice when you end up with this, you get imaginary solutions, because under the radical here, you end up with a -7. So you convert it. Now, if you're doing a paper test, I would accept this with the I there. MATLAB wants you to put the I there. So part of the protocol in doing the practice is you see how they want the answer. And this is then for everybody. This is how they want the answer. Okay. Now in this one, they're saying the f function and the g function equal each other. So you just set it up this way. And then going back to chapter 6, where you had rational equations, that is equations with fractions, you're going to multiply each term by the common denominator, x squared. You get rid of all the fractions, put it in standard form, and again, this might be factorable. And it looks like it is as I look down at the solution. But they're asking you to use the quadratic formula to solve it. So if you solve it, again, you have to identify the A, identify the B, identify the C. Carefully substitute, and when you end up with a 1/2 and a -4. This would factor. And let me show you the factoring, because the other work is there. So 2x, x. You need sort of an 8 in the middle, so there's a 4. And this will need to be positive. This will be negative. So there's your positive 1/2 out of there, and there's your -4 out of there. Again, factoring would have been much easier, but you may not have known that that could be factored. And they asked you to do it by the quadratic formula anyway. Okay, approximating solutions. If you have your calculator, you're going to put values into the calculator. They'll give you a long decimal. They are irrational numbers. You usually round it to 3 decimal places using the skills that we've done. Okay, so here I like it. They're giving you a nice little summary. Factoring, principle of square roots, completing the square, and the quadratic formula. And through practice and your quiz bees, you'll earn your mastery points. And by the way, I just lowered them. I took out one of the things I was working on, and it was a little bit too difficult. And you're going to have plenty of stuff to do. So instead of 121, it's down now to 120. Okay. As we complete section 8.2. Okay, this is a short one. The other one was long.